In November 2023, the residents of an ordinary five-story apartment building on Oktyabrski Prospect in Velikie Luki began noticing a strange smell. At first, it was barely perceptible, sour, as if something had gone bad somewhere, and no one paid it much attention. But within a few days, the odor grew denser, heavier, and after another week, it had become so overpowering and sickeningly sweet that it made your throat burn. It seeped through the kitchen and bathroom vents, crept up from floor to floor, and there was no escaping it. One of the neighbors guessed it was a rat, must have gotten into the ventilation shaft, perished there, and was now decomposing. For an old Soviet-era panel building, that's a perfectly normal story, so the residents filed a request with the management company and asked them to send someone out. The company promised to take care of it, but no repairman came. Not the next day, not the following week, and the smell wasn't going anywhere. So the neighbors began to adapt. Some taped over the ventilation grates with duct tape, others stuffed them with rags. People set up air fresheners, kept their windows open constantly, even though it was already cold autumn outside. But in the stairwell, the smell lingered all the same. And here's what's interesting. It was strongest on the second floor, right by one particular door. She kept to herself. Sometimes she'd be seen in the courtyard, not alone. There was a younger one with her, very small. The apartment attracted no attention. No screaming, no arguments, no loud parties. An ordinary life, no different from any of the neighbors. And here's what's crucial to understand. No one knocked on that door. No one asked if everything was all right in there. It didn't even occur to anyone to connect the smell specifically to this apartment. The neighbors kept waiting for the repairman. They filed follow-up requests with the management company, complained to each other. And behind the wall, the smell kept getting stronger. On November 23rd, Vasya walked into the stairwell of that same five-story building, the boy who lived separately with his grandmother in another city and rarely visited. He hadn't seen his mother in a long time, but he had his own key to the apartment, and that day he decided to pay her a visit. He climbed to the second floor. The smell in the hallway was thick, but Vasya, most likely, didn't think much of it. Vasya ran out of the room, grabbed his phone, and immediately called his grandmother, Yelena. The recording of that call has not survived, but what is known is that within minutes, Yelena was already dialing the police, reporting what had happened. A patrol unit arrived at the scene fairly quickly. Officers went up to the second floor and entered the apartment. The apartment was immediately sealed. The stairwell was cordoned off, and a forensic investigation team was called in. The investigators began their examination. In the kitchen, there were unwashed dishes, leftover food. In the bathroom, clothing was scattered about. And in that same room, on the lower bunk of a bed, someone had been sleeping there not long ago. The sheets were rumpled. Various small items lay scattered nearby, 2 levels of a single bed. Below, traces of recent ordinary life. Above, what remained of it. The apartment had been locked from the inside with a single deadbolt. The windows were intact, no signs of a break-in or any attempt to enter from outside. Whatever happened here, it happened within these walls, and whoever was behind it had a key. The team worked in the apartment until late that evening, and what they discovered inside went far beyond a routine call. Garbage bags were everywhere, on the floor, in the corners, along the walls. The walls were peeling, wallpaper coming off in strips, cockroaches crawled across the kitchen. In the hallway, you could barely squeeze through the clutter. The apartment looked as though it had been neglected long before the police arrived. Both findings were on the upper bunk. A bunk bed. They were preliminarily identified. They were the youngest members of the family, the ones who had lived in this apartment. One was 4 years old, the other just over a year. Judging by the condition of what was found, they had been there not for a day, not even a week. Most likely, months. In the bathroom, they discovered something else. 2 chihuahuas. They had simply stopped being fed. The bathroom door was closed and someone walked away. No water, no food, no chance of getting out. The outcome was the same. When investigators pulled the records on the apartment's registered occupant, they learned the family had 5 members. 2 on the upper bunk of the bed. The eldest, Vasya, the one who made the discovery. 1 more, the youngest, had been living with her mother in this same apartment. Most likely, it was her belongings on the lower bunk, but there was another one, the oldest of those who had stayed with the mother. She wasn't here, not in Velikia Luki, but in a private house in another location, the village of Mokryki, Kuninsky district, Pskov Oblast, about 100 kilometers from the city. A second investigative team was immediately dispatched there. The house stood apart from the neighboring properties. Quiet, closed up, no signs of life from the outside. When the officers entered, it was the same picture of neglect, the same smell. On the bed, under a blanket, lay the third discovery, the eldest of those who had remained. 3 discoveries in a single day. 2 different addresses, 100 kilometers apart. The one who should have been present at neither location was found that same day, November 23rd. Daria Sukhanova, 34 years old, the very woman who was the registered occupant of the second-floor apartment. She wasn't hiding, hadn't left the city, hadn't tried to flee or disappear. She was simply living with her latest partner. A few blocks from Oktyabrski Prospect, going about an ordinary life. When the police came for her, she got ready calmly, without unnecessary questions, without any resistance. In her first interrogation, Sukhanova carried herself as though she were walking into the investigator's office over some routine household matter. She didn't cry, didn't refuse to answer questions. She sat up straight and spoke in short, calm phrases. The investigators had been prepared for hysteria, for silence, for denial, the standard reactions in situations like these. But instead, they received a version of events that made the room go quiet. Sukhanova claimed all 3 had passed in their sleep, on their own. It had happened back in August, she said. She discovered that they were no longer waking up. First one, then sometime later the second. The third, by her account, was the same, but later and in a different location, in the village of Mokryki. She presented all of this as though describing something entirely mundane. Not a tragedy, not a catastrophe, just an everyday fact that happened, and that was that. The investigators asked the logical question, why hadn't she called an ambulance? Why hadn't she contacted the police? Sukhanova had continued receiving government payments for all 3. The money arrived monthly into her account. No agency had requested verification, no one demanded an in-person visit, no one checked whether those for whom the benefits were issued were actually present. The system simply transferred the money automatically, and nobody asked questions. 3 passing in their sleep, on their own, at roughly the same time, a version that not a single person in that room believed. The investigators needed to understand who they were dealing with. Daria Sukhanova. A name, an address, a statement. Now they needed a profile. They started with her circle. They found a former colleague. They'd worked together at a bar several years ago. A typical neighborhood establishment, standard work as a waitress. The colleague remembered a completely different Daria. Outgoing, cheerful, no complaints about life. She showed up for her shifts on time, got along well with customers, didn't cause any problems, no conflicts, no odd behavior. She was 25 then, and already had 2 sons. People knew, but it didn't attract any attention. A young woman working, getting by. Daria had never been married. Her partners changed. First, she lived with a man named Artem. He, according to the investigation, was the father of 1 or 2 of the oldest children. Then Artem left. Another man appeared, then the next one after him. The relationships didn't hold. No one stayed for long. The men left, and Daria kept having children. By the age of 34, there were already 5, all from different fathers. The eldest, Vasya, was by then living separately. The other 4 remained with her. None of those questioned described Daria as aggressive or unstable. No breakdowns, no outbursts, no unusual behavior. Calm, smiling. That's how those who crossed paths with her remembered her. The investigators needed to find the breaking point, the moment when this Daria, outgoing and seemingly problem-free, became the woman sitting before them in the interrogation room. So far, no one could see it, but there was one point the investigation did find rather quickly, and it turned out to be a full 7 years before that November of 2023, the year 2016, that very same apartment on Oktyabrski Prospect. One of the younger members of the Sukhanova family, very small, was playing with his older brother Vasya in the room that day. They were standing by an open window. 6th floor. A fall. The ambulance arrived at the scene, but there was no one left to help. Officially, what happened was classified as an accident. A tragic accident. The kind that, unfortunately, happens in families with small children. But sources familiar with the circumstances of that case used a different word. Mysterious. Where exactly the mother was at that moment is not indicated in the available materials. The matter was never publicly clarified by the reviewing authorities. No criminal case was opened at the time. The investigation went no further than a preliminary review. But it was precisely after this incident that the Sukhanova family first came to the attention of social services and law enforcement. And at that same time, something else happened. Something that 7 years later would prove decisive. Grandmother Yelena came to Velikie Luki and took the eldest, Vasya, to live with her in another city. No formal procedures, she simply came and took him. Sukhanova didn't resist, didn't try to get him back, didn't raise any objections. From 2016 on, Vasya grew up with grandmother Yelena. He started school, moved from grade to grade, studied, socialized with peers. Yelena attended parent-teacher conferences, kept track of his schoolwork and his appearance. A normal, ordinary life, one he certainly wouldn't have had if he'd stayed in that apartment on Oktyabrski Prospect. It was he, now a grown schoolboy, who 7 years later would reach into his pocket for his key and open that same door on the 2nd floor. But for now, in 2016, his grandmother simply took him far away. Perhaps not fully understanding herself what exactly she was taking him away from. After what happened in 2016, the state apparatus did respond, at least formally. Daria Sukhanova was placed on a preventive monitoring list. Inspectors began visiting her. The visits were scheduled by the book. Commissions, inspections, reports. An inspector would come, document the condition of the apartment, note whether there was food, whether it was clean, whether everyone who was supposed to be there was present. Sukhanova would open the door, show the rooms, answer the questions. On paper, the oversight was working. Most likely, Sukhanova knew in advance when each inspection was coming. She had time to prepare, clean up the most obvious things, air the place out, put something resembling food on the table. The inspectors saw what they were shown. Everything looked normal. This continued for 4 years. Time after time, the same routine. A visit, an inspection, a report, a checkmark. Year after year, the system documented the same conclusion. No violations, no complaints, no incidents. In 2020, the commission reached a decision. Sukhanova had reformed. Monitoring was lifted. Oversight was terminated. From that moment on, not a single inspector crossed the threshold of the apartment on Oktyabrski Prospect. Not in 2021, not in 2022, not in the summer of 2023, when behind that closed door, the very thing those inspections had existed to prevent began to unfold. For 4 years, the system watched. Then it decided it was no longer needed. And behind that door, only those it was supposed to protect remained. At some point, another child appeared in the apartment. Sukhanova gave birth at home, alone. She didn't call an ambulance, didn't seek a consultation, didn't check into a maternity hospital. In 2023, the youngest was born. During her interrogation, Sukhanova couldn't name his exact date of birth. She wasn't hiding it, she simply didn't remember. Not the month, not the day. She hadn't remembered the day he came into the world. Not a single document had been issued for him. No birth certificate, no insurance, no medical record, no entries at the clinic. Not a single doctor had examined him. Not a single nurse had come for a postnatal visit. The local pediatrician didn't know that anyone had been born at that address. The civil registry didn't know. The pension fund didn't know. Not a single government database contained a single line about his existence. As far as the system was concerned, this person did not exist. He became invisible from day one. No number, no record, no notation. Nowhere. Not in a single registry. The logic is simple. No registration means no data. No data means no one to check on. No one to check on means no one to ask about. The circle closed. It was possible to be born, to live for some time, and to leave no trace. Not a single agency, not a single person in the government chain ever learned about it. Andre remained in the apartment the state had long forgotten, but he wasn't the only one there, and what their daily life looked like is a story in itself. None of the younger children went outside, at all. Not into the courtyard, not onto the landing, not to the store. Nowhere. The apartment was the only space they knew. The door to the stairwell never opened for them. Behind the wall lived neighbors, people walked downstairs, someone was strolling in the courtyard, and on this side of the door existed a closed world that no one on the outside knew about. None of them was enrolled in school or in a preschool. 4-year-old Mark spent entire days sitting in a crib with raised sides, in a diaper, without toys, without books. The crib stood in the room, and he simply remained in it for hours, even days on end. Not because he couldn't get out, but because it was his only place. He knew nothing else. Sukhanova came and went. She had her own life beyond the apartment. Inside, food appeared when she remembered, not on a schedule, not by any routine, whenever it occurred to her. Sometimes she'd bring something, sometimes she brought nothing. The gaps between her appearances could stretch. Remnants of what had once been food lay on the floor, on the table, on the bed. No one cleaned up, no walks, no fresh air, no contact with anyone beyond those walls. Total isolation, not locked from the outside, not forced in any formal sense, but absolute in reality. Nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no one outside even suspected that anyone was behind that door. And this continued, not for a month, but for years. But the summer of 2023 became the turning point. The apartment on Oktyabrski Prospect changed. People began coming here. Sukhanova started hosting gatherings. Alcohol, casual acquaintances from the neighborhood, people from old circles. They'd come in the evening, stay until late at night, sometimes until morning. According to the investigation, among the regular guests were those who used substances. The company changed, the faces changed, but the core stayed the same. Drinking and random people in an apartment where, in the next room, the youngest members of the family were present. What exactly happened during those evenings? Who came and in what condition they left? The investigation pieced this together later, through the testimony of neighbors and acquaintances. Then the absences grew longer. 2 days? 3. Sukhanova would simply lock the door and leave. The children were left alone. The youngest at that point was not yet a year old. No food, no water, and no one beside them. This was a system. The investigation would later view what was happening not as negligence and not as ordinary neglect. The theory was harsher: systematic deprivation of sustenance, a consistent pattern of behavior. She would leave them alone, and return when she felt like it. Each absence lasted longer than the last. The conditions in the apartment reached a critical point. The end was approaching. August 2023. Sukhanova returned to the apartment after several days away. What exactly happened inside that evening is known only from her own words, given to the investigator months later. There were no other witnesses in the apartment. Mark was in his crib, crying. Sukhanova approached and sat on the edge. What happened next took 5 minutes. Mark went silent. Sukhanova stood up and left the room. Later, during her interrogation, she described everything in 3 sentences. What she did, how, and how long it lasted, in an even voice, a single tone, without hesitation. When asked to repeat, she repeated it word for word, like instructions she had memorized. The investigator asked why. She was silent, not out of stubbornness, not out of fear. She simply had nothing to say, no motive, no trigger, not even a coherent description of what she felt in that moment. Nothing. A void. 5 minutes is not an instant, it's enough time to stop. She didn't stop. Sukhanova didn't dial a single number. Mark remained in the apartment, right where it all happened. She continued living as if nothing had changed. He lay where she had left him, and he became the first, but not the last. A week and a half passed. During that entire time, Mark remained in the apartment, in the same room. Sukhanova took no action. She didn't move him, didn't conceal anything, didn't take anything out. She simply left him there and went on living her usual life, a week and a half, side by side with what she had done. Then she went to Andrei. He was approximately 6 months old. He was in that same apartment, in the same space where, a week and a half earlier, everything had begun. Sukhanova repeated the same thing, the same silence afterward, between the first and the second. 14 days. Not minutes, not hours, but days. It was a repetition. The investigation would later characterize what happened in precisely those terms, not as 2 separate episodes, but as a series. During interrogation, she described this episode in the same tone, the same words. Then she took both of them, moved them to the upper bunk of the bunk bed. She laid one on top of the other, covered them with blankets, neatly, carefully, the way you cover someone who's fallen asleep. This wasn't an attempt to hide them. It was more like staging. The blanket, the positioning, everything looked as though someone on the top bunk was simply sleeping. That's what Vasya would later discover. 2 on the upper bunk. But still in the apartment were Nastya and Stesha. Sukhanova gathered up the girls and left. She locked the apartment and never returned. She took them to Mokriki, that same private house in Kuninsky district that the investigation would only discover in November. But back then, at the end of summer, she arrived there herself with the 2 girls. The house was uninhabited. No electricity, no running water, walls, a roof, a door, and that was all. Late August in Pskov Oblast is still tolerable, but ahead lay September, October, November, nights growing longer, the air growing colder, and inside those walls, not a single light would come on. Sukhanova chose a place as far removed from anyone's attention as possible, not a city, not a town, a village where houses stood far apart from one another, where the nearest neighbors were a walk away, a place where you could live for weeks and not a single person would know. Why she brought the girls here specifically isn't entirely clear from the case materials. Perhaps she was fleeing the smell, which grew stronger by the day in the sealed apartment. Perhaps she wanted to be somewhere where there would be no witnesses. Guaranteed. Perhaps both at once. One thing the investigation established with certainty: Sukhanova left that place and took with her those who were still alive, into a house where no lights burned. It's also important to understand that Stasia had a father, Ruslan. He would take her to his place for weeks at a time, buy her clothes, confront Sukhanova over the child's dirty feet and unkempt appearance. Stasia was the only one the mother would take outside and post about on social media. Mark, Andrei, Nastya, for all 3 of them, the space marked __quote_0__ was blank. No one visited, no one asked, no one came to check. Mark, according to Sukhanova, was also fathered by Ruslan, but he refused to acknowledge it. And from that moment on, for Mark, the crib with the raised sides began. Not a single photograph of him alive. During interrogation, Sukhanova explained everything herself, in that same even voice. She didn't touch Stasia because the father was involved in her life. He would have noticed. He would have started looking. But those whom no one was watching, they disappeared. The one being watched by even a single person, she remained. Sukhanova herself articulated this logic. She assessed risks. She chose. And if that is calculation, then she is competent. If competent, she bears full responsibility. But the psychiatric evaluation would say otherwise. That, however, was still far off. For now, Sukhanova had returned to Velikiye Luki with Stasia, to the same apartment where, on the upper bunk of the bed, what no one was ever supposed to see remained. Stasia slept below, on the lower bunk of the same bed. 3 months passed this way. Sukhanova didn't live in the apartment full-time. She came and went, to her latest partner, a few blocks from Oktyabrski Prospect. Sometimes she took Stasia with her. Sometimes she didn't. When she didn't, Stasia was left alone in that very room where, on the upper bunk, Under the blankets, what had been lying there since August continued to lie. August, September, October, November. Over 3 months, the smell saturated the walls, the furniture, the belongings. That very smell the neighbors mistook for a rat in the ventilation. Stasia lived inside it. Ate, slept, breathed, in a space that grew more unbearable with each passing week. Did she know that those on the bunk above weren't sleeping brothers? Did she understand at 5 years old what was happening? That's not in the case file. Doctors and psychologists worked with her afterward, but the results were never published. What is known is this. When Stasia was found, she was alive, but in a condition that required immediate medical intervention. 3 months, not days, months. A sealed apartment, garbage, cockroaches, food scraps on the floor, a mother who appeared when she felt like it, and silence on the upper bunk. And beyond those walls, Sukhanova led a life in which none of this seemed to exist. For 3 months, she didn't simply stay silent. She built a system. She lied to everyone differently, and everyone bought it. She wouldn't let grandmother Yelena into the apartment the entire time. Yelena would come. Sukhanova wouldn't let her in. At the same time, she herself would visit her mother, bring groceries, chat. When Yelena asked about the grandchildren, she answered calmly, "Everyone's alive, everyone's fine, Nastya's going to school, the younger ones are at home." Not a single one of those words was true. On social media, she continued maintaining her account, took care of her appearance, kept up her image. In the fall, an acquaintance visited her at the rented apartment where she lived with her latest partner, Pavel. The setting was ordinary, nothing resembling a den. At the same time, she was visiting the liquor store multiple times a day. Those same 60,000 rubles continued arriving in her account every month, for all 3. And over those 3 months, not a single agency requested verification. Not Child Protective Services, not social services, not the pension fund. The system paid automatically and asked no questions. If Vasya hadn't come on November 23rd, there's no telling how much longer this would have continued. Sukhanova changed her story 3 times. First she cried, said they had passed in their sleep on their own. Then she said something different. There was nothing to feed them with. It was from hunger. And then, during the crime scene reconstruction, she demonstrated everything herself. The investigative committee released the video. In it, Sukhanova stands in the apartment next to the investigator. She walks up to the bed and demonstrates. She sat down, covered the mouth and nose with her hand, held it. Then the second episode, the same method, a week and a half later. Then the third, in Mokriki. When asked, quote 1, the answer that followed was the one every news outlet in the country would go on to repeat, quote 2 by suffocation. The third, according to the prosecution, the same. The account of an illness affecting Nastya was dismissed by the investigation. No traces of any illness were found. Additional charges, cruelty to animals, for the 2 dogs sealed in the bathroom, and fraud. After everything, she had continued receiving payments and misappropriated over 80,000 rubles. Quote 3, was that an explanation or a symptom? As it would later turn out, the answer to that question would come from the psychiatric evaluation. Sukhanova was sent to Moscow, to the Serbsky Center for Psychiatry, the country's leading institution for such cases. The principle of criminal responsibility. The question before the experts was singular. Did she understand what she was doing at the moment she was doing it? If yes, a full sentence. If no, compulsory treatment with no fixed term in the conventional sense. And here was the contradiction the experts had to resolve. On one hand, a woman who calmly explained during interrogation why she hadn't touched Stasia, the father would notice, who lied to her mother for 3 months that everyone was alive, maintained social media, collected benefits, kept up her appearance. This is the behavior of someone who calculates consequences. On the other hand, a woman who described what she had done without a single emotion, like reciting instructions, who made no attempt to conceal what she had left in the apartment, who couldn't remember the date of birth of her own son, calculation, or disconnection. The experts were tasked with drawing that line. While Sukhanova was in Moscow, her pre-trial detention was extended. The hearing was held remotely. She couldn't make it back to Pskov Oblast in time. The result of the evaluation would determine everything, and it would not be the one people expected. The evaluation delivered its conclusion. Sukhanova was found to have a mental illness. According to the Velikiye Luki Citizens public page and the investigation by Komsomolskaya Pravda, the experts concluded that at the time of her actions, she was not aware of their nature and was unable to control them. This meant one thing, not a penal colony, but compulsory psychiatric treatment. The investigation was concluded. The case was sent to court. The court decides not the length of the sentence, but the nature of the medical measures. Stasia was handed over to her father, Ruslan, the very one who used to come, take her for weeks, buy her clothes, the one thanks to whom she survived. Vasya remained with grandmother Yelena, and in the case materials there remained something else. Witnesses told journalists that Sukhanova had been pregnant and given birth multiple times, but some of the infants then disappeared somewhere. No confirmation was released by the investigation, but the question lingered, and there is still no answer. 3 confirmed, 1 in 2016 under mysterious circumstances, and an unknown number of those whom perhaps no one will ever learn about. She chose whom to keep. Said she was tired, but exhaustion doesn't explain 3 repetitions. She was on a monitoring list and was taken off it. Not a single inspector crossed the apartment's threshold for 3 years. Money kept arriving for those who were no longer there. The answer isn't only in her mind. It's behind every closed door that no one bothered to look behind. What do you think about this video? Write in the comments. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like. See you next time.